The story of Whitin is the story of the Industrial Revolution in Massachusetts. It starts with an agricultural community on the banks of the Blackstone and Mumford rivers, and it finishes with the largest textile machinery company in the world.
Paul Whitin came to the community as a young man. And so Paul grew up here in the local schoolhouse number 2, went to education till the age of almost 12. At that point, he dropped out of school and he apprenticed as a blacksmith.
And he ended up in blacksmith business as a partner with James Fletcher, who owned the water rights to the Mumford River in the center of town, the area now called Whitinsville. What drove the Industrial Revolution in its earliest years was water power. So he who held the water rights was a key figure.
Mr. Fletcher was the large landowner, owned all of what is now Whitinsville, had a sawmill, had a forge, and Paul Whitin just happened to fall in love with his daughter.
Paul married James Fletcher's daughter, Betsy. Paul was 26, Betsy was 16. Her father and Paul were partners in the blacksmithing operation right here on the Mumford River. Paul and Betsy had 10 children. The first 2 children died in early childhood. They had 8 surviving children, 5 boys, 3 girls. As Paul worked with the growing blacksmithing business and used the river for trip forge and hammer, around him, some mills were developing, textile mills particularly. Just across the road, there was a cotton mill.
Mr. Fletcher had the foresight to realize that there was money to be made, and so he brought Paul Whitin in as his son-in-law and invested in that mill in 1809.
When you look at the basic story, you see that Paul Whitin and his father-in-law, James Fletcher, built this little mill in 1809. Okay, simple enough. But when you go a little bit deeper, you can see how it fits into this bigger boom period, specifically when you look at who some of the other investors are. A guy named William Howard. He comes up and he's a guy who's trained by some of the master mechanics of Providence. He's working with all the Sam Slater technology, and he brings it to Whitinsville. And he trains Paul Whitin. So he gets to learn, this literally the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution story from these master mechanics. We see this huge boom, and with all those mills, or almost all those mills, we see the creation of the mill villages, and we see the change of the landscape. They're building dams, they're creating reservoirs, they're building these power trenches and the raceways. And now, of course, you have people who are going to be coming in from the farms and working in these villages and living in these villages. That's the revolution. That's when we're seeing a change in where a large number of people here in the Blackstone Valley, where they live and where they work, really changes in that period from about 1807 to 1815. And of course, Whitinsville sees itself getting into the textile business right during that period.
The company was called P. Whitin & Sons, but Paul Whitin owned it all. One of the interesting things is that Paul really had no interest in the mill business himself. He continued with his forge and his foundry and his blacksmithing, and the boys ran this company. And in 1826, they built what is now called the Whitin Mill, the first major mill on the river.
The Industrial Revolution had started here, and the Whitins took advantage of that, and they expanded very quickly. And I think from that point on, the transformation of Northbridge from an agricultural village to an industrial village was established.
John Crane Whitin and his brother Paul, back in 1826, got together with their father in an operation called Paul Whitin & Sons. And Paul Whitin died 5 years later, 1831, and Betsy Fletcher, the powerful mother, said, we've got to keep this operation going. So she went into a partnership with 3 of her sons, and later a 4th son. But Betsy was the driving force here. She kept the people in line.
She was a strong matriarch. Paul Whitin died in 1831, and they renamed South Northbridge here Whitinsville in his honor. And then she took over as the matriarch, and 4 of her sons, Paul Jr., John C., Charles P., and James, all the sons would always go to Ma for advice, and she kept them all together as one company.
Betsy Whitin was almost a more important force in the development of the Whitin companies than was her husband Paul. After he died, she had weekly meetings on Sundays with her 4 sons to talk about how the business was going. You know, you never hear of a woman running a business of that magnitude in those days, but all of the expansion and growth occurred while she was the overseer. I'm not saying she ran day-to-day operations, but she held the family together. Between 1831 and the Civil War, the family enterprises grew 8-fold. Their original 1826 mill was expanded. They purchased mills in Whitinsville, in Riverdale. They purchased a mill site in Rockdale where the water rights came with the site, in Uxbridge and in East Douglas. In 1864, Betsy Fletcher, who was now an old woman, had decided that it was time to split the company up. In that split up, John got what was to become the Machine Works. James, who was the youngest and the last to join the company, got the mills in Uxbridge, commonly known as the Crown and Eagle Mills, and it was a fairly substantial cotton operation. The Whitinsville Cotton Company and the one in East Douglas went to Charles, and Paul took the Rockdale and Riverdale mills. So there were now 3 separate cotton companies and 1 machine company. By this time, the Whitins had gained ownership of virtually every significant mill on the Blackstone River in Massachusetts. There was a Boston newspaper that said that Whitinsville is a village where capitalism, feudalism, and communism exist in perfect harmony, and I think there were elements of all 3. You know, the company did well by its workers, and its workers did well by the company.
They really built up one of the greatest empires here in the Blackstone Valley. They're really the only ones that are both in the textile production and the textile machinery production. And so you really have this huge empire that spans both sides of that line. For the first generation or so, there's enough local labor to fulfill the needs of the mills. Beginning in the 1820s, the first major wave of immigration that we get, it's mostly Irish labor as well as other English and Scottish workers who come. Those folks are going to be mostly skilled textile workers. The next major wave that we see comes during the Civil War. Huge waves of immigration coming out of Canada. But then we also see other pockets when the Whitins start bringing in the Dutch cattle herders to work with their herds. You get this Dutch population. There's an Armenian population that comes to Whitinsville. Folks from all over the world, from Russia, from Italy, all these people coming to the Blackstone Valley for these opportunities. Part of that change we also see socially. In that first generation, you're working with your cousins, you're hiring your neighbors, you're working on the floor of these people. They're your friends, you know them. So that's going to be a lot different than, say, 1870, 1880, where the mill owner's grown up in a mansion. He's the 2nd or 3rd generation mill owner. His workforce now, they're not his neighbors. They're from Quebec, they're from Italy, they're from wherever. And so the stratification kicks in, this more of a paternalistic system where there is no question about who's on top and who's on the bottom.
It certainly was a paternalistic community, as many other mill villages were. And the Whitins took care of all of the needs of the individual. They took care of providing company housing for low rent. They provided services to the town. They had a company store. Certainly having put a lot of credence into religion and making sure that their workers were churchgoers, whether it be in the beginning, Congregational Church, which the Whitins themselves were members of, but also when the Irish came on to work for the Whitins, they donated to St. Patrick's Church and likewise to the various different immigrant groups in their churches. Streets were plowed, coal was delivered. Every 5 to 7 years, homes, apartments were painted, re-wallpapered. Anything you could think of, the Whitins took care of.
They treated everybody equitably, but at the same time, as anybody would, they knew who they were. If you met somebody who'd say, "Where do you live?" and they'd say Hill Street, and you knew right off the bat. If they said that A or B or C Street, it was a different equation. So you knew everyone's status basically by where they lived.
Oh, I was born in Plumbers, which is a section of town of Northbridge. My parents came from Poland. My father worked in the foundry. My mother was a house mother.
I was the first baby born on Woodland Street, one of the White Machine Works tenements. Well, my father was a steam fitter, and he spent his whole life here working, 40-some years.
They built the library, they built the town hall, they had something to do with the schools. They were the father of the town.
They supplied the lawn mowing, snow removal, garbage removal. They painted your house, your tenement every 5 or 6 years, but their wallpaper and their colors.
They built the gym, and membership was, I think it was $1 a year. And if you couldn't afford the $1, then they let you in. And there were all kinds of activities going on in the gym.
The shop paid you, and the shop took the money away again because you paid for rent, you paid for the milk that they were producing on the farm, and if you went to the company store, you were buying at the company store. The money was certainly staying local in those days. It was keeping everybody here and happy and working.
Whitin was not noted for the wages they paid, but they were noted for taking care of their people. And during the Depression, Whitin kept men working in the plant.
They tried to keep all the people that were married and had families, and a lot of the elderly that didn't have any income, because in those days, Whitin did not have a pension plan, so it was a little difficult, and of course, Social Security wasn't available.
Those who grew up in town and experienced the White Machine Works in its heyday understand it was a very congenial, collegial atmosphere where everybody knew everyone else.
But it wasn't a close social interaction. There was a definite remove between the Whitins and the workers.
You see that with the Whitins. They would put the next generation in charge, and of course, as the community grew and the Whitins got wealthy, they built their mansions amongst the worker housings all over the village.
The manor house was the Josiah Lascelles house. Gaga had Louis Comfort Tiffany redecorated.
We used to be able to hear the music when they had coming out parties up there, and all the rich people came to town and the beautiful cars coming to town. Mr. Swifts and the Masons, they were the ritzy people in town. And that old Mrs. Whitin, I never really met her, but I knew a woman that was her head cook. So when she was away once, she had her niece and myself to go for dinner one night. And I went through Mrs. Mason's house, and she had fabulous Chinese vases. When I went home that night, I kept thinking that I'd gotten into one of those vases and couldn't get out. They were taller than I was.
It was a different lifestyle. Mr. Swift's mansion, the first time I went in there, I didn't know which way to look. It's huge, it's beautiful, the grand staircase and all. And after a while I thought, well, they're all homes to the people. They built what they could afford and they're living there. So I couldn't complain about my home because it was nice too.
Often when I do my tours with students, I'd take them to the modest Fletcher house of 1770, then into the mills, and finally into one of the mansions, and they could see the growth of what industry did for this community, the roots of our history here, and they see the economic growth and the economic wealth that was brought to the Whitins, but also how the community prospered as a result.
One thing that sets the Whitin enterprises apart from other mill operations in New England is the sense that everyone was in it together and that the company would do whatever it could to try to keep people at work and employed. It was not a model that would survive well in the latter part of the 20th century, but in the 19th century, you had a situation where I think that people were able to enjoy certain things that others in other communities were not because of the company.
One of the things that we begin to see is that mills start developing down south for a couple reasons. One, you're closer to the cotton, so you don't need to ship it. Secondly, they don't have unions down there, so the wages are about a third of what they have to pay up here for the mill workers. And so we begin to see, again, as early as the 1920s, even before the Depression kicks in, mills around here begin to shut down.
The Uxbridge Mill, the Douglas Mill, the Whitinsville Mill, they all were shuttered by the 1920s because they failed to diversify. The Riverdale Mill had burned in the 1890s, never to be reopened by the Whitin family. Everything was consolidated in the Paul Whitin Manufacturing Company down in Rockdale. The Rockdale Mill was a pioneer, beginning to produce rayon, for instance. And the Rockdale Mill was used as a testing ground for Whitin Machine Works equipment as Whitin Machine Works diversified. So diversification was really the key to survival.
The labor movement throughout the Northeast in particular was becoming strong, and so labor started to organize in the mills. When they were pushing for unions, the Whitins gave them a choice, unionism or paternalism. You can't have the best of both worlds.
At the same time, the federal government is really pushing these companies, when organizing drives take place, to agree to have a union because we're ramped up for war production.
World War II particularly put the machine works back to work. I mean, we just finished the Great Depression. The machines were not being sold in as much volume in the 30s. And suddenly the war came, and the Whitin Machine Works decided that its future in the war years lay with the production of auxiliary engines for the merchant marine fleet. And so they geared up for heavy production.
So at a rare point in American history, I think workers have the upper hand in a way. People show up here and begin to make the case that you can't eat paternalism. Your wages are lower than the wages of other people. Stand on your own 2 feet. Why are you letting this family boss you around? Why are you letting these characters control your life? And they bring in workers from other parts of the country who are in unions and making a lot more money than the workers here. And so it becomes like this very sort of rich, sort of fertile ground for pushing the argument.
In '46, there was unionization and a strike. And my grandfather, I think, was quite unhappy about this. He didn't think that this, what all the family had done, that this was what they deserved.
The union vote was very close. A lot of families, there'd be 3 or 4 brothers that all worked at Whitin, and a couple of them would be union members and the other 2 would not. It was like the Hatfields and the McCoys. The company didn't really want to accept the union. The shop would not subsidize a lot of the things that they had done previously. They decided to sell all the shop housing, and that was a shock to a lot of people.
For years, I think the townspeople didn't realize how much the Whitins really did. They paid low taxes, and once the Whitins were gone, they thought those inner workings were going to all continue, and the funding of the heating and the maintenance of the town hall would continue, but they soon realized we now have to pick up all the slack.
For a while, there were people that said, good, we'll be on our own. Not necessarily so. People were lost. You didn't know where to go. You didn't know what to do. I was amazed at how many went on welfare. And welfare was ready to close their doors because they couldn't afford it, because Whitins took care of all of that. They ran the town. No two ways about it. And once they left, you realized what they did for you. At least you should have, because they did a great deal.
It was clear that Whitin was troubled. And eventually an outfit called White Consolidated Industries bought the company. And basically that was pretty much the end of it.
I was the last one out of the plant, the last Whitin machine work.
I think that the Whitin family culture was one of fairness, equity, honest dealings, civic responsibility.
It's a pretty unique community where, for a number of generations, you're talking about 150, 160 years, people were able to pour their heart and soul, literally their lives, into making this community work against really long odds.
I think that they showed that for 125 years, one family can make a difference.
When the Mills died, the community didn't. Whitinsville thrives today, and just recently has been made part of the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park in recognition of its role in the Industrial Revolution and the role that the Whitin family had in it.
It's a walking town. People know each other. It's great to do business here. There are unique shops and opportunities. And the buildings and architecture are lovely. Even the mill structures. I always like to say that our motto here is restore rather than destroy.
We've been very fortunate that the mills have been occupied. There's multiple businesses doing multiple different things in these places, whether it's electronics or entertainment or just small office space.
It's always a struggle for a town to almost reinvent itself. But I think it's that New England ingenuity. It's an entrepreneurial spirit, and it lives on today.
When the mill went out of business, it was a turning point for the entire town.
People that kind of realized that the Whitins aren't here anymore. We have to step up as a community.
There was a lot of resilience in this community, and I think that people believed in the vision that was started by the Whitin family for community values, community service, community support. And when there's a need in the community, we look at that and say, how can we, as a whole entire town, address this situation?
So I think from supporting their schools, supporting their teams, supporting the public safety staff that works here, supporting their neighbors, it's just been a great, well-connected community from the town to local nonprofits to local businesses.
Whitin Community Center is this iconic social, physical, mental health organization that supports that community spirit that George Marston Whitin, who we're named after, purported in everything that he did. He envisioned a recreational facility that people could come together, address their physical health, but also their mental health. The vision of George Marston Whitin was all about service to your community, values, and the community center is that place.
There's a lot of environmental pride here too. The Heritage Corridor, keeping water quality up, keeping our trails growing and going. I mean, it's beautiful here. It really is quintessential New England, quintessential Americana.
Whitinsville today is historic, and it is feeling a part of something. And I think that our park, our historic focus, our community spirit tell a story about how Whitinsville was founded, but also just how we are continuing that legacy 150 years later or more.
I mean, it's why we're now part of the National Park System. We are the truest sense of a complete mill village. They're proud of their heritage, they're proud of their history, they're proud of today, they're proud of where they're going. When you have that type of culture, that type of mindset in a community, people are there for each other. And it's just such a commitment to the community to make it a great place to live. So kudos to the people here in Whitinsville.